I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Alamayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Alamayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, in London for Alamayadeen television. But talking about a subject of global importance, namely the tendency towards rearmament rather than disarmament, proliferation of nuclear weapons rather than its opposite, and the danger of a new arms race which will destabilize the world. Britain is, of course, a nuclear-armed power. That's what gave it the seat on the permanent five on the Security Council of the United Nations. But even its conventional firepower is significant and, over recent decades at least, frequently used. British arms are being used in the Saudi-led coalition war against Yemen, extremely controversially. In fact, it may well be the case that the United States of America pulls out of that war before the British do. It is the case that Britain is a foundation member and a pillar of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I spell out the meaning of its acronym because that's honoured more in the breach than the observance these days. The North Atlantic is, frankly, the last place in the world you're going to find the North Atlantic Treaty Organization deploying its weapons these days. Even Colombia in South America is now an associate member of NATO. Go figure. Now, of course, every country needs a defence. Every country has to defend its borders and its essential interests, and it's no part of my brief to argue against the maintenance of a well-staffed, well-paid, and highly efficient armed forces in Britain. But I do myself have questions about the investment, disproportionate investment, that we make in nuclear weapons, which by definition, can never be used. For if they were used, they would be retaliated to, and the whole country, which I love, would cease to exist. The vast disproportionality of Britain's expenditure on Trident nuclear weapons is contested by many senior military officers, admirals, field marshals, generals. Many people in the armed forces community would rather that that money, hundreds of billions of pounds, should be spent instead on conventional weaponry, conventional armed forces. Yet, in the teeth of all of the facts that there is now no superpower adversary, the Warsaw Pact no longer exists, Russia is no longer a communist country, China shows no intention whatsoever of fighting us except in the tills of the shops and the supermarkets and hypermarkets around our countries. The fact that we are still now expanding our nuclear weapons force and expanding our expenditure on military spending on hardware rather than on people, more or less, is a matter now beginning to be debated here. Of course, there are many other countries that are spending far, far more, particularly the United States of America, which spends more on military spending than the next 10 countries in the world put together. Just think about that. Now, I'm joined by very distinguished guests today to discuss this question. Why has Britain increased her military budget, and her stockpile of nuclear weapons. Robert Shaw is a defence and security expert, 2 decades in the British Army, and a man who's well versed in the arts of intelligence. He managed training for the UN and NATO in Afghanistan, Libya, Ukraine, Nigeria, and Somalia. And he has a master's in global security. I told you they were distinguished guests. Robert, what's the answer to that basic question? Why?
Well, first of all, the forces always need to keep up to date. We always say the forces are there ready to prevent conflict, and they do that by being a deterrent. To be a deterrent to any adversary, you need to look credible and you need to have up-to-date modern equipment. The problem is we don't stand in isolation with anyone else, not only our allies, but any potential adversary is out there always modernising their forces. Russia has completely modernised its nuclear weapon systems since the end of the Cold War. China is looking to extend theirs and get, in a sense, a second strike capability as well with submarine firing ballistic missiles, etc. So in a sense, to keep that deterrent and keep the peace, we must modernise ours. Unfortunately, modern weapon systems, very complex, very, very expensive, and it comes with that huge tag and bill. But a lot of the military, to be honest, have been underfunded for years. I did see a comment earlier about them being well paid. They certainly are. I totally agree with you with that, George. They are very well paid, and some of their pensions are fantastic for senior officers. However, there's a lot of underinvestment in infrastructure. You've got guys living in crumbling old World War II barracks. There have been minus hot water showers for months on end, poor quality food, etc. And so the army really does need money, not just about buying new tanks or, improving the nuclear weapons, but it needs to seriously invest in its people and being able to retain and keep those.
Well, we may in fact be about to abandon tanks as obsolete. My point is yours. There are soldiers, the PBI, the poor bloody infantry, ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-equipped, ill-armoured, and ill-paid, whilst huge, gigantic sums of money are spent on maintaining a nuclear weapons force. For what? You make the point that the Russian nuclear arsenal has been modernised. It has, and of course it is many times the size of ours. If we fired one nuclear weapon at Russia, it would fire 20 at us and would no longer exist. That's a really important point to make. So how credible is this posture, and how good economics is it? Military economics is it? Wouldn't we better be spending this money on more soldiers, better soldiers, happier soldiers, than on weapons that will never be used?
I do see your point. We all hope that obviously nuclear weapons will never be used. But again, it is that deterrent factor. They need to be modernised and keep up to date. We've actually got the British Army's probably got the minimum amount of warheads it can have under treaties.
Yes.
It only maintains
but we
one
are about to
submarine at
increase
sea.
them. We're committed by the NPT to reduce them, but we're actually going to increase them. Yet at the same time lecturing other countries that they mustn't dare seek to achieve nuclear weapons.
Well, I think it's a global policy that we don't want nuclear weapons expanding across the world and everybody having them. We just need to modernise the ones that we've got. And again, that it's all about that deterrent factor, really. Russia proved the fact that they are a deterrent, because during the Cold War, they had a plan to invade West Germany called the 7-Day Plan. And funnily enough, because Russia's policy at the time was to use, for it to be acceptable to use tactical nuclear weapons in a first case scenario without being struck by them first. And in fact, that's still their policy today. And what they did was, you'd note with that plan that was done during the Cold War, they actually were going to tactically nuke and then invade all of the countries, funnily enough, and get to the Rhine within 7 days. That was the premier of the plan. But the nuclear strikes were only on countries that didn't have a nuclear deterrent. Therefore, they weren't going to strike France, Britain, or the US with nuclear weapons, knowing that it would be responded to.
Well, you couldn't have with tactical weapons too far away. But this is a subject of great interest to the new generations, of course. Anti-nuclear feeling, the feeling that this kind of apocalyptic talk that you and I are having about, well, first strike, second strike, we're talking about an existential threat to the existence of humanity
Yep.
with these nuclear weapons. Now, Patrick Christy, you are our resident young person. You are our up-and-coming radio and television star and journalist. How do you feel do you feel uneasy about the fact that we are blithely increasing our nuclear firepower?
Yeah, firstly, one day I'll start shaving and then we can all crack on. But look, yes, I do, because I didn't live through the Cold War, so I didn't experience what was clearly a very real threat, and the kind of educational videos that used to be pumped out in schools about what you should do if a nuclear bomb went off.
Go under the desk.
It seems like a sci-fi film for me. I've got to be honest with you. I'm aware that it happened, obviously, but. Look, I am concerned about it. Do I honestly believe that we'll ever enter into a nuclear holocaust? No. That said, did I ever think we'd confront a global pandemic and end up in lockdown for a year? No, I didn't either. So maybe I'm wrong about everything. But look, my take on this is the fact that I can understand why the government wants to increase its nuclear arsenal. I'm not necessarily agreeing with it. I think, you made the point there that if we find one nuclear warhead at Russia, they'd fire 20 back. The whole thing's irrelevant, isn't it? Once you find one, it's game over, isn't it? No matter how many, as long as they exist. So my take on this will be this. I think the government might be increasing its nuclear arsenal to mask the problems that it's had with its own armed forces and their funding. The service for our the grouping, the amount of people that we have now in our military has gone down for 11 years in a row. Certainly in the army, the rest of the elements of the military have stagnated or dropped as well, and that's been a massive issue that we've had. I would raise the point: why join the British military now? There was a report that was commissioned by the Select Defence Committee. Tobias Ellwood came in and said this. It was titled Obsolescent and Outgunned, which I think sets a tone, doesn't it, for the thing. Basically, the upshot of this was if Putin or Xi Jinping rolled the tanks in, we'd be absolutely knackered. And it needs a lot to happen for us to rectify that. Not only are we going to send we talk about the fact that our troops are the best trained in the world, and they may well be, but they're using outdated and obsolescent equipment. Then when we send you to fight and lose limbs and fight terrorists around the world, or what we bracket as terrorists around the world, when you come home, we've signed the military covenant, which says that you should get priority housing and mental health care. Now, all too often, that is not being adhered to by local councils. And so why join the British military? Well, we send you off to battle, sometimes under-equipped and outgunned, as this report says, and then when you come home, we won't look after you either. And the numbers are dropping. It really is a tricky time for the British military, and I can understand now why the government might want to cover that up by saying, hey, look, we're spending loads on nukes.
You raised the T word there. I should have actually in my opening remarks. Isn't it the case that our number one enemy is not Russia or China or Iran? It's terrorism. A man with a dirty bomb in the boot of his car, or even just a man with a rusty knife on London Bridge. These are the real threats that we are actually not properly equipped to deal with. I mean, I'd rather than have 2 or 10 more nuclear warheads, I'd rather have more people guarding our borders. I'd rather have more people guarding our people on the streets, wouldn't you?
Yeah, look, 100%. And I think Britain needs to hold its hands up as well to some of the threats that it's created itself. We've meddled in the Middle East, and now sometimes we get the receipts served back to us, don't we, on the streets of London Bridge or Borough Market or whatever. Sometimes that happens. And I agree with you on that completely. What I will say is this, which I think is for far too long, the entire world's thing was put into nuclear weapons. Well, actually, I think what you made the point there that I don't think China or Russia are our main enemies. You're absolutely right. However, I do question how much we can trust the Chinese government at the moment. I think there's a few reasons for that. And actually, conventional weapons in certain settings around the world are being used to great effect, and we are clearly not up to scratch in those departments. So it makes sense for us to try to reinforce our conventional weapons, which we're not doing by redeploying the nukes. What I will say about Britain is, look, I think we've made a lot of problems of our own making. We let in a higher proportion of returning ISIS jihadis in Saudi Arabia, and that is saying something, and they're only the ones that we know about, frankly. And I think that's something we need to have a long, hard look at ourselves about. Really.
I'm sure we will. We'll come to the economic issues raised by this military expenditure in a minute. But let me quickly take an American point of view from David Rovics, who's a well-known musician and activist and live stream broadcaster. David.
My pleasure.
Could you start by perhaps telling us a little bit about the military budget in Britain?
I think there's so many really alarming things going on with all this talk about China and all this increased military spending in the UK and the US. And I mean, I think the military spending is because Britain is still an empire, and part of a broader U.S. empire, and they have lots of imperial plans.
Is the policy of expanding the military budget unique to Britain, or is the same thing happening around the world?
I mean, there's this mythology about the Cold War, and this mythology that goes back such a long way about how the Western countries like the US and the UK were trying to compete with the Soviets and all this. But what you see when you look at the actual reality is it is the US and the UK and France that are taking these initiatives. In this case, very much, the US to this $100 billion program to miniaturize nuclear weapons. It's and the first strike capabilities, the submarines that surrounded the Soviet Union, that still surround Russia, the putting nuclear weapons as close as possible in the water everywhere around the country, whereas their weapons are primarily still land-based. I mean, you can see, you look at the history and you look at the present, and NATO is the aggressor here. The UK and the US are the aggressors here. That's very clear. And Russia is scared in a defensive position and they're surrounded. I mean, people are scared there because it looks like NATO wants to invade them, because NATO is constantly doing military exercises on the other side of their borders all over the place, and surrounding them with nuclear missiles, and now working on miniaturizing nuclear missiles, which is a path towards actually using them. And the idea of actually using them is completely, as they used to say, unthinkable. But apparently it's not unthinkable, because both Democrats and Republicans think it's a good idea here to come up with new generations of miniature nuclear weapons. And it seems there's a lot of politicians in Britain that support the idea as well.
As a member of public, how do you feel about Britain increasing the budget for nuclear weapons rather than striving harder for disarmament?
Well, at the same time, it's really contradictory. It's really a contradictory time right now, in this time of stimulus, because like here in the U.S., as in with many other countries in the world, especially the rich countries, we've just passed a massive stimulus package, as they call it, which is going to actually benefit tens of millions of people in this country in a really serious way, including my family. And this is the kind of thing that points to the possibility of what life could be like in a actual functioning democracy, where we actually look after the population, like they do much better in many countries in Europe compared to here, or compared to in Britain. It's here you have millions of people living in tents on the streets. I mean, the comparison is just terrible, and the need for housing and for healthcare and for food, it's just so obvious. And you look out of your window in this city, in Portland and in New York and Seattle and all over the country, and you just see dire poverty. And many people coming here from the United Nations who are used to refugee camps look around in the cities in the United States, and what they talk about are conditions that are worse than many refugee camps, because people don't have access to the kind of hygiene that they often have access to at UN-run refugee camps. It's a terrible, tragic situation, and we don't need $700 billion a year being spent on the military. We need none of that. We need all that money being spent on the needs of the people. It could be a beautiful place, this country and this world, if the United States and the United Kingdom were not spending so much on the military, and more than spending money on the military, if they weren't actually using their militaries to destroy the lives of, untold millions of people in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and so many other countries, and cause massive refugee crises and that lead to, more far-right governments in Europe and all kinds of other consequences. This is on the US and the UK, on the governments, on the Labour Party, on the Conservatives, on the Democrats and the Republicans, who have all been supporting these kinds of policies.
Shabir Razvi, is all this money being wasted, or does it have some economic benefit as a multiplier, for example? I don't know how many jobs are supported by military expenditure, but is that part of the thinking, or is it just a kind of Potemkin affair? We are nuclear armed, we are powerful, even if behind the facade our people are hungry.
That's a very important question when we look at the whole military expenditure. Our friend from USA said, 750, 80 billion being spent on military whilst people are sleeping on the streets. So obviously there's a downside to expenditure on just military. If you're talking about any nation having armament, what should be the purpose of it? It should be defensive. I understand. I agree with that. But are we really spending that much for defensive purposes or really to venture out in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, or wherever the situation may arise? And that requires money. And especially, the irony is, sometimes I feel like laughing or crying. Only just a week ago, when we were talking about sort of expenditure on military, our nurses were being awarded only 1%, whilst we were sort of made to go and clap in the streets for the early part of the lockdown, and we give a miserly 1% to the so-called sort of warriors.
Yeah.
Sorry, the warriors. So this is the whole sort of contradiction in military expenditure. Look, the reality is that, like my other colleagues have quite rightly pointed out, that nuclear weapons really do not protect us in that way. If we are talking about annihilation, just like John Kennedy famously put, if I remember correctly, is that man must end war, otherwise war will end mankind. So if we are really on that trajectory that we want to annihilate each other, then really it doesn't matter. Okay, but if we are going to be conscientious about human beings, about sort of creating a better environment, more economically viable, so that the disparity between the rich and the poor in the West, which has become very, very prevalent, as you well know, even in the UK, the demand for food banks has increased tremendously, not just during the last year due to pandemic, but really the whole last 10 years since the economic crisis. So we are facing colossal issues in our countries. Britain, which is not a poor country, is the 5th or the 6th largest economy in the world. Therefore, no one should be going hungry in a country like this. No one should be sleeping on the streets of London or other cities. If we are not able to manage the rudiments of providing sustenance to society, why are we spending money on nuclear weapons or upgrading nuclear weapons when they will not come in handy at all? And I do want to say a point about NATO, the acronym, which is North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I would today call it the North Atlantic Terrorist organization, because that's what they've been doing, terrorizing the world, whether it's in Afghanistan and other places, and continuously taking money from Europe, from America, from Britain, for what purpose? Whilst that sort of money could be spent on improving infrastructure in the USA, or providing better social security, or getting rid of the food banks in our country, George.
Powerful stuff. There'll be more of it after the break. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Alamayadeen television, coming from London, but discussing issues that are of great moment around the world. The expenditure of extreme amounts of money on weapons of death and destruction, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Robert Shaw, isn't it all about empire building? I don't mean in the traditional way, I mean internally. The NATO has built and built and built itself with no particular barrier or boundary to their ambition. I mentioned earlier they're far more often to be found outside the area of NATO as originally envisaged. And inside our own armed forces, the people in control of the Trident program are snaffling up more and more of the military budget. isn't there, you're an army man, isn't there a feeling amongst the army, the poor bloody infantry, that we're spending too much on that part of our expense, our defence effort?
Absolutely. There's always going to be internal politics. And unfortunately, like anything, we can't just, in a sense, make money. There is a set pot to spend on military expenditure and modernisation. And, you know, it has to sort of cover all bases, where they're going to completely restructure to meet the future, hence the comment about the cyber units, etc. in space. That's where threats are, so therefore they're going to change the composition of the force itself.
You can't fight that. You can't fight those threats with nuclear weapons, by definition.
Absolutely.
I mean, one can see the case for increasing one's expenditure on cyber warfare. Frankly, I prefer cyber warfare to real warfare.
Yeah.
At least you're only destroying computers and systems. But you can't fire nuclear weapons at a cyber attack. You can't fire nuclear weapons up into space. You can't fire nuclear weapons at ISIS or Al Qaeda. It's just, I just feel it's more and more an anachronism, this nuclear strike force.
Well, again, it's not so much a strike force, it's a deterrent. And that's the thing. If you don't have it, any other country that has got nuclear weapons, and don't get me wrong, it would be great if the whole world didn't, and we didn't have to deal with that problem. But I can't turn back time. I don't have a TARDIS. At the end of the day, nuclear weapons exist. Other countries have got stockpiles. Other countries have got policies of use. So ultimately, to have a deterrent from being struck by nuclear weapons from other countries, no matter who they are, we need our own. Albeit we don't need a large stockpile, we need a small one, as in a maintained one, that just the minimal sort of thing to deter. But again, it needs to be modernised, it needs to be up to date, it needs to be a deterrent. And that's the whole point. We won't be striking anybody, we won't be using it as long as it remains a viable modern deterrent.
I scratch my head at that. I mean,
Not
well
so much
explained.
striking targets with it.
You know, well explained, but I do end up scratching my head at that. Why you need to increase the number of weapons. You might say you need to polish them more or maintain them, but why do you have to increase them?
Right, because it's not just about those weapons themselves, it's about countermeasures to them. And again, since the end of the Cold War, a lot of countries have developed anti-ballistic missile systems, etc., to defend themselves against it. And it's always that balance of first strike, second strike. You know, have you got enough of a modernised deterrent that if the enemy do try and strike you first, that you can still retaliate? Hence the majority of them being submarines. That's about a second strike capability, a response. And so to overcome these area denial systems that other countries have got, like China and Russia, the ones with nuclear weapons, they have to increase the amount of warheads in the same way that conventionally you need more sort of drones and unmanned systems.
Although, ironically, the countries that have evinced most aggression and hatred against us over the last period have been our former partners in the European Union, not Russia and China. Shabir, forgive me, I didn't really get an answer to my earlier point. If you have one, please give me it. Is there any upside to this level of military expenditure, economically speaking? Does it generate research, development, jobs for engineering, manufacturing, and so on? Is there any good comes of it?
Well, look, George, often that argument is used, and I think there's a fallacy in the argument that armament provides employment, it sort of provides opportunity for science and technology to develop, R&D. And the biggest argument, as you well remember, the deal that was made with Saudi Arabia by dear Margaret Thatcher, Yamama deal.
That was the biggest sale of anything to anyone ever in history.
And it still continues till this day to a degree.
Nice work if you can get it.
and the bribes in that were about £6 billion.
Yes,
I remember.
Yes, and not all of them were to the Saudis.
Well, only 1 billion went to Prince Bandar al-Turki. The other 5 billion went to some other places, if you like. And also our friend, Mr. Blair, dare I say, stopped the investigation into the deal using the argument, which we were trying to sort of allude to, is that it will impact employment in our country. Now, that argument really needs to be done away with and really strongly sort of argued against. If military expenditure or military exports bring employment to this country, why can't we go for environmentally friendly products? Why can't we create more education opportunities? People still want to learn English all over the world. Why don't we spend more money on that? That will create employment for teachers, for schools, for academia, all kinds of other. If we
Shabir,
really-
I travelled the whole world as a member of the British Parliament. Nobody ever asked me if we could send them more British bombs.
Exactly.
Everybody always asked me, could we send them more English language classes?
You actually have sort of, clearly illustrated what I was talking about. Because whenever I travel in the world, people say that, how can I get to England? I say, why do you want to get to England? They say, I want to learn English. So there is that, soft sail,
Soft power, yeah.
that we have, and we are not really using that in a proper way to create more employment, to create more exports, to create all kinds of opportunities that would arise out of being a more peaceful nation rather than an aggressive nation and selling armaments. I mean, dare I say that Britain was the largest supplier of armament to Saudi Arabia last year, as you well know. It's been documented recently. Where are those armaments ending up? They're ending up in Syria. They're ending up in Yemen, killing ordinary people. So blood is on our hands when we are selling these armaments for the sake of creating a few thousand jobs in this country. Is that really a good policy? And then Mr. Raab comes out in the last few days saying that we are going to continue to sell armaments to anyone, doesn't matter what their human rights record is. So the reality is that we've completely shied away of having a moral high ground or any ethics at all. And finally, I do want to say something really quite important, is that we have to evaluate that, are we as a human race, 8 billion people living on this planet at this time, do we want to really annihilate the mankind out of their wits by killing them altogether through nuclear weapons? I don't think it makes sense at all.
In an era where we're supposed to be building the stockpiles down, Britain has just announced it's going to build its stockpile up. Now, one man who, at the very top in British journalism, has been charting this issue for many years is the former Guardian correspondent, foreign affairs expert, Jonathan Steele. Jonathan, what's your take on Britain's defence spending?
Well, I think the British government wants to remain a close ally of the United States. And the US has been pushing all of NATO countries, member countries, to spend more on defence, at least 2% of their GDP. And Britain is now going to go up to 2.2%. So we're showing the Americans that we are very good, loyal allies of them and following their instructions about spending on military weapons.
What's the significance of this, especially at a time when our state budgets on other things are in such terrible straits?
Well, it's a good question because there's no obvious answer to it. It's strange that, as you say, the time of crisis when there's a big row going on about paying nurses only 1% increase and other people have had their wages frozen, that the government think it's necessary to spend more on defence. I mean, they've produced this strategic review, which was supposed to outline the threats facing Britain, but they didn't really come up with anything new except cyber warfare may be the new thing of the future, and they're going to spend some more on space, including militarization of space. But nobody's going to attack us from space, so it's a bit bizarre to be increasing spending on space militarization. And then, of course, there's the nuclear weapons issue. We're increasing nuclear weapons by more than 40%, from 180 to something like 260 warheads, which is, again, quite unnecessary and not well explained. Boris Johnson in Parliament, when he announced it earlier this week, couldn't give a very clear explanation himself.
The lifting of the cap on nuclear stockpiling will be quite controversial in some quarters. Do you think there will be a backlash?
Well, in Scotland and in other parts of the country, people are asking, why is it necessary? And the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, although it supports nuclear weapons in a way much more enthusiastically than Jeremy Corbyn did, they have queried this rise in defence spending and they're worried about conventional issues like tanks and body armour and other things for infantry should have been more should have been spent on that rather than on nuclear weapons. And then, of course, there are people who are suspicious at all of increases of military spending who don't want to see any spending on nuclear weapons either. So there's a broad front of criticism that the government is facing.
Is this move not actually contrary to the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
That is true. That's part of the agreement of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was one of the sort of conditions that other countries would agree not to build their own nuclear weapons or buy their own nuclear weapons from somebody else, on the understanding that the 5 major nuclear powers would gradually reduce. And that's part of the bargain has never been met. Ever since the NPT was signed about 25 years ago, there's been an increase in nuclear weapons. We are looking forward to a US-Russia agreement, which at the moment the START agreement is running out in a few days' time. And that's going to be renewed. Both sides have agreed to renew it, which puts a ceiling on the US nuclear weapons and the Russian nuclear weapons. So it is odd that just at the time when the major nuclear powers are controlling their numbers of warheads, Britain should increase.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but since the NPT was signed, is Britain the first country to actually admit that it is increasing its arsenal rather than cutting it?
Well, the figure has always been given of how many nuclear warheads we have, but this was one of the points that Boris Johnson made, was that from now on, after this, we won't give details of the numbers of weapons. So it went down under David Cameron's government from about 225 to 180. So there was a reduction. Now Boris Johnson is increasing it not to the same level it was when David Cameron was Prime Minister, but beyond that, from 225 to 260. So, but he says, any further increases or changes will not be announced in terms of numbers.
Where do you think we're headed? What are the consequences of this increase in the number of warheads, both in terms of the finances of it, but also the military strategic impact of it?
Well, I don't think, in fact, anything much will be done about it. The other countries won't criticize Britain, the other nuclear countries, and the political opposition in Britain is not strong enough to overturn the decision. So it will remain as it is, with a lot of question marks, a lot of concern, and a lot of doubt as to why it was necessary and why the priority has been put on nuclear weapons when we have so many other things that we need money to spend on, including the welfare system, social care, health service, education, and so on.
And finally, Jonathan, does the public just have to accept this? There's nothing can be done about it?
The Labour government coming in might change it, but of course there's no election for another 3.5 years, and the Tory government that we have at the moment has a large majority in Parliament. So there wouldn't be a revolt or rebellion by any backbenchers on the Tory side over this. So the government will get away with it.
Patrick, it was rather a remarkable statement that Dominic Raab made, although it's not as remarkable as it sounds, because although Robin Cook declared we were going to have an ethical foreign policy, either he didn't believe a word of it, or at least Tony Blair, his boss, didn't believe a word of it, and we never did get an ethical foreign policy. Perhaps Mr. Raab's just being honest. We are going to sell weapons to anyone, whatever their record on human rights.
Yeah, a few things on this. The day that a teacher costs the same as a bomb, that's when we'll see some real change, and that's the sad fact about this, right? So what I will say about Dominic Raab is I've always kind of been mystified by the concept of Dominic Raab. I don't quite understand him. He always strikes me as the type of person who looks exactly like, just before you hit a rabbit with your headlights in a car, that kind of look. That's Dominic Raab's political career. I've never understood the concept of Raab. But
I wonder if he's our first artificial intelligence.
What are we ready for?
He may be our first artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I wouldn't surprise you.
He may not actually be human.
He doesn't sleep at night. You just turn him off. But anyway, regardless, having said that, we did live through Theresa May, didn't we? So also, I imagine I should probably stop saying this, otherwise I'll get sued. But however, in terms of what we're talking about now, I think we're arguing, aren't we, about whether or not the way that the government is spending its military budget is correct. I think that maybe there's a danger of us missing a relatively obvious point, which is that I don't agree with it, but I can understand why they feel the need to. Right? We are in a situation right now where, for the first time, really, we're now out of the European Union. I think the vaccine rollout has shown that we can't necessarily trust our European friends as much as we thought that we could. Joe Biden, now in charge of America, he is someone I think for the first time now we're looking at it. And is our oldest ever ally as much of an ally as maybe it
Very good point.
was? Okay.
Very good point.
Now then you look at what China's doing. Now look, okay, China's China, okay, but you know there's issues there. Russia will always be Russia again. So now, for the first time, given especially the chaos that will come out of this pandemic, Britain very much is arguably more alone than it almost ever has done. So I can understand that a government might be looking at this and thinking, ultimately, our first duty is to protect our own citizens. What we're going to do, we're going to put a load of money in nukes, because that's what we have to do. We can share. So I can understand it. I don't necessarily say I agree with it. I think we should stop being mystified as to the reasons why they're doing it. I think, you know, whether or not they've made the right decision is one thing, but I can understand the reasons behind why they've decided to do what they've done.
Robert, I think that is a very good point, blindingly obvious or not, but it's not being widely discussed. Joe Biden doesn't like Britain very much for a whole range of reasons. Ethnic background, politically, he doesn't actually like Britain very much. Is Patrick right that maybe we're doing this because we feel a little bit more friendless than we did in times by?
Well, I think despite any sort of political relationships that we have with other countries, they're always in transit. Politicians, luckily, don't last forever. They get voted out and they move on, and somebody else does. What I would say from a personal level, on the ground, having worked with most people in NATO, 47 nations, and certainly the Americans a lot, I would say on the ground, you know, we're all very much alike and we actually do cooperate, and that relationship is as strong as ever. Realistically, it's just you're always going to get individuals, even within foreign militaries. I met American military officers that particularly didn't like Britain when I worked with them in Afghanistan. You're always going to get Anglophobes and you're going to get Anglophiles.
But how do you deal with Patrick's point that not many people are joining the British military? It's not very attractive. It's not very well paid, and it is shamefully disregarded and actually subject to neglect on a big scale. If you come back from the army and you're psychologically damaged, don't expect better treatment, expect less. If you come back and you're homeless, most of the people that are on the streets homeless are people of military background. The prisons are full of people from a military background. It's not a very attractive prospect joining the military now. That must dismay you.
Well, in a way it does, due to my experience, George. What I would say is that the recruitment and retention for the military has always waxed and waned. And a lot of it is dependent on outside economics. If everyone is broke and unemployed in England, the recruitment office expands and people join the military because it's a job. There's always going to be that hardcore professionals in the British military that join because they want to be soldiers and always have done. So you always get those green-eyed boys that will keep the standard up of professional soldierism, regardless of the others that join it for the money. The professionals don't join for the money. They join because they want to be there and defend their country, if you see what I mean. They believe in it. So that will always change. What I would say is I completely agree with you. The military has been atrocious in the way it is treated its soldiers over time, but then it always has. Hence some of Rudyard Kipling's poems about Tommy this and Tommy that. It's still the case. So the problem is a lot of them have come from poor urban inner city areas. They, poorly educated. They've seen a life of crime their entire life. The army will make them, if you see what I mean, can make them, set them off on a new path, confident, trained, etc., and give them a chance in life. Or they're going to end up sort of drunk, alcoholic, drug takers on the streets or criminals. But that's not necessarily because of the army. That's because we recruited them in the first place and they were already broken. The
Scottish comedian Billy Connolly had a sketch when I was very young, even younger than Patrick. Join the army, tour the world, see wonderful places, meet interesting people, and kill them. Isn't that the problem, Patrick? I mean, you'd have to get one hell of a haircut if you joined.
Yeah. I don't think I'd fit in, do you?
If you joined the British Army.
Be a secretary.
But amongst your cohort, amongst your generation, I mean, we went in your era, Robert, we didn't fight all that many wars. But recently, we've never been out of wars. I mean, from Sierra Leone, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, obviously, Libya were involved, Syria were involved. I mean, it's one long bloody war. That must put people your age right off.
Yeah, and I think actually there's a lot of people my age now who are perhaps more politically, I think social media's got a lot to do with this, just general things have got a lot to do with this. They're more worldly wise, I think, than they were, and they have stronger opinions. Plus, also in this country, now we have, you know, a huge amount of immigration, and the population is getting more and more diverse, and that therefore means that more people are hailing from some of the countries, frankly, that we tend to invade, right? And so, are you likely to join the army? No, you're not. And then when you get into the schools and the education system, frankly, I think among younger people, there's much more of a kind of, I don't really particularly like this term, but a woke culture, right? And also a tendency to denigrate Britain's past. Look what's happening now with the fact the police, whether or not they have to, they are guarding the Winston Churchill statue. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know. And so you look at it then and you think, well, what's the uptake in the military like? What's the appetite for joining the military like? And what's the kind of the questions when you join the military? And I think, by the way, I think the military can be a wonderful thing for lots of people. Don't get me wrong. But when you're sent off to fight somewhere, let's say we get involved even more than we are in Yemen or somewhere, it's not just the fact that you just blindly follow orders anymore. There's a lot of people now that are more aware. Palestine is another thing. You know, you draw battle lines before you actually get into the military, for goodness sake. And I think that's something that applies to a lot of people my age. And so, as a result of this, I think the military is a lot less attractive prospect for people my age than it perhaps used to be in the past, because maybe people are more aware of actually the political nature of the military. The military itself is not the problem. Sometimes the politicians use the military for a nefarious purpose, and that's the issue, and people are more aware of that now.
Shabir, last word to you. We've invaded half the world. We've conquered half the world. The British had an empire so vast that the sun never set upon it. Though, as my Irish grandfather used to say, that's because God would never trust the British in the dark. You're originally from a part of that empire. Do you hate the British military?
I think hate is a very strong word, George. So, you know, we don't have enough time to go into the philosophy and the philosophical aspect why hate shouldn't be part of the vocabulary anyway. What I would say that I come from London. I didn't know that London is part of the British Empire.
I meant historically.
It's nice to see it come back on you for a change, because normally that happens to me.
Where are you from? I'm from a couple of streets from here.
Exactly. Yes, it's the bastion of British Empire, London, but certainly not the British Empire, if you like, in that sense. So look, Britain obviously had a footprint all over the world. That's the reality of it. However, I think, you know, Shashi Tharoor, who is an Indian politician who has spoken very eloquently on the British Empire and what British Empire gave to the world. You know, people say that, you know, if it wasn't the Brits going to India, India would have been a poor nation. But I don't want to repeat what Shashi Tharoor said. He said that 25% of the GDP at that time was produced by India. And when British left, it was only 4% of the GDP. And also, you know, the classic statement that Shashi Tharoor says that, you know, people often tell the former people of the colonies, particularly Indians, that you didn't get on the bus. Shashi Tharoor replies that British pushed us under the bus. Therefore, we were not able to get on the bus. So there are a whole host of issues that need to be explored. But what Britain did is that, you know, through the empire, through extracting all the wealth from the poor nations, we have become strong. Okay, we have become prosperous. We've had the welfare state. So if, you know, immigrants come to this country for betterment of their economic life, I really have no problem with that if they can come legally. And, you know, even our current Home Secretary, what I call the PPE, Priti Patel experience, you know, is really of Ugandan background. As you know, if it wasn't during Idi Amin's period, if the Asians were not allowed to come to UK and settle here, she would not have become the Home Minister in this country. So there are lots of benefits that the immigrants bring, certainly from the former colonies to the UK. The economy grows, and as Patrick says, you know, the diversity of culture. People get to know each other. People appreciate that, you know, if you've got a Syrian or an Iraqi living here, why did he come? You know, because obviously Saddam created a huge problem for the Iraqis. That's why they came to UK. And why did Saddam create the problem for his Iraqi? Because we supplied him with the weapons. We allowed him to sort of have an 8-year war with Iran. We allowed Saddam to use chemical weapons and all kinds of things. That's why people escaped from it. Therefore, we have an obligation as Britain, as a empire which benefited from the wealth of the other nations, to really allow those people who can come here legally and contribute to the nation.
Well, I'm very glad that the Empire sent us Priti Patel, the worst Home Secretary we've ever had. But alas, we've run out of time. I hope you enjoyed that tour across the British historical, military and strategic horizon. I've been George Galloway. You've been a marvellous audience. Thank you for watching.